Picture this. Donald Trump, with a stern face, steps up to a podium and delivers a chilling declaration that would reshape an entire continent's airspace overnight. To all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. This isn't just a threat of military action. This is a high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar experiment in kinetic financial warfare, where fighter jets and missiles are deployed to solve an economic problem. The stated objective is to suffocate the financial pipelines of the Maduro regime, specifically the illicit revenues flowing from drug trafficking and illegal gold mining. But for sophisticated viewers of history and finance, we know that when the military tries to destroy an illicit market, it often triggers one of the oldest and most destructive economic paradoxes. Today, we are going to calculate the true cost of this hypothetical no-fly zone, NFC. We are not focused on military strategy. We are focused on the collateral financial damage it would inflict on legitimate actors versus the actual impact on criminal profits. The NFC creates massive, certain costs, billions in added operational expenditures for global airlines forced to reroute, immense spikes in war risk insurance premiums, and a giant, sustained bill for the US taxpayer. But on the other side, here is the paradox. History has taught us that aggressive military interdiction often fails to destroy illicit markets. Instead, it can actually buoy the economics of the drug trade. By introducing risk, you force smugglers to demand a higher risk premium, which translates directly into higher profits for the most ruthless criminal organizations that successfully shift to new routes. The central question is this: could this multi-billion-dollar military operation inadvertently become a massive, taxpayer-funded financial subsidy for organized crime in the Western Hemisphere? Before we dive into the ledger, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and whether you think financial intelligence or fighter jets are the best weapon against a cartel. Let's follow the money. Before we even get to the drug cartels, let's talk about who pays first. Regular people, airlines, and businesses that have absolutely nothing to do with cocaine or gold smuggling. See, when you close airspace over a country the size of Venezuela, we are talking about 916,445 square kilometers, roughly twice the size of California. You don't just inconvenience drug dealers. You fundamentally reshape the economics of an entire continent's air travel. Let me paint you a picture of what happens on day one. You're a family in Buenos Aires trying to fly to Miami for vacation. Your normal route, straight north over Venezuela. Flight time, about 7 hours. Fuel consumption, let's say 20,000 gallons for a Boeing 777. Now with Venezuelan airspace closed, that same flight has to swing wide east over the Atlantic or west over the Andes. Your flight time, now 9 or 10 hours. Fuel consumption, maybe 28,000 to 30,000 gallons. That's an extra 8,000 to 10,000 gallons per flight, burning a hole in the airline's budget and ultimately your wallet through higher ticket prices. We've seen this movie before. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, European and Asian airlines were forced to reroute around Russian airspace. Some flights from Europe to Asia had to add 4 to 6 hours to their journey times. Airlines like Finnair, which built their entire business model around being the fastest route from Europe to Asia by flying over Siberia, saw some routes become completely unviable. They couldn't charge enough to cover the fuel costs and still compete. The financial impact was staggering. The International Air Transport Association estimated that the conflict-related airspace closures cost the global aviation industry several $billion annually in additional operating costs. And that's just from closing Russian airspace. Venezuela sits at a critical crossroads for North-South American aviation. Here's the cruel math. Every single legitimate flight between North America and South America now carries an extra cost burden. Multiply that by thousands of flights per month, and you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in additional costs annually, costs that get passed directly to consumers, businesses, and airlines already operating on razor-thin profit margins. But the rerouting is just the beginning. Now we need to talk about something most people never think about: war risk insurance. Every time a commercial aircraft takes off, it's covered by insurance. But there's standard insurance, and then there's war risk insurance, the kind you need when you're flying near a conflict zone where military aircraft might be shooting things down. When the US enforces a no-fly zone, even if you're routing around Venezuelan airspace, you're now flying in proximity to an active military operation. Insurance companies aren't stupid. They know that accidents happen, GPS coordinates get mixed up, communications fail. A nervous pilot in an F-16 might make a split-second decision that turns a passenger jet into an international incident. History is littered with these tragedies. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing 290 people. The ship's crew mistook the Airbus A300 for a fighter jet. In 1983, Soviet fighters shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, killing 269 people after it strayed into prohibited airspace. When there are fighters in the air with authorization to shoot, commercial aviation becomes exponentially more dangerous. So what do insurance companies do? During the Persian Gulf conflicts, we saw commercial insurers either cancel coverage entirely for certain routes or increase premiums by 300% to 500%. Some airlines literally couldn't afford to fly certain routes because the insurance alone exceeded the profit margin on every ticket sold. This isn't theoretical. We have the receipts. During the height of tensions in the Persian Gulf, airlines faced war risk premiums ranging from $10,000 to $50,000 per flight, depending on the route and aircraft size. Scale that across all the flights affected by a Venezuela no-fly zone, and you're adding hundreds of millions more in annual costs to the aviation industry. These insurance costs don't just disappear. They get baked into ticket prices, they reduce airline profitability, they make marginal routes unprofitable, and they force airlines to cut service to smaller cities in South America that depend on air connectivity. You've just economically isolated millions of people who have nothing to do with drug trafficking. Here's something even more uncomfortable: the legal exposure. The Chicago Convention of 1944, the bedrock of international aviation law, states that every country has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. When the United States unilaterally declares a no-fly zone over Venezuela without United Nations Security Council authorization, it's operating in a legal gray zone. Actually, forget gray, it's operating in a legal minefield. If a US fighter jet accidentally shoots down a commercial aircraft, or if a commercial aircraft crashes while taking evasive action to avoid US military aircraft, who's liable? The airline, the pilot, or the United States government for creating the hazardous condition in the first place? International law would suggest the latter, and that means every single flight operating in the region represents potential multi-billion-dollar legal liability exposure for the US government. We are talking about potential compensation payments that could dwarf the entire annual budget for the operation. Think about it: one major incident involving a commercial aircraft with 300 people on board could result in liability claims exceeding $3 billion to $5 billion. That's the cost of settling wrongful death claims, compensating airlines for destroyed aircraft, and defending against years of international legal proceedings. So before a single drug trafficker is inconvenienced, we've already imposed massive financial burdens on legitimate commerce and created billions in potential legal liability. The meter is running, and we haven't even discussed whether this operation would actually stop the drug trade. Spoiler alert, it won't, but it will make it more profitable. Now we get to the heart of the matter: the economics of the drug trade and why military pressure often backfires spectacularly. Understanding the target, the money pipeline. First, let's be clear about what we're trying to stop. Venezuela isn't just a transit country for cocaine anymore. Under Maduro, it's become an integral part of the production and trafficking infrastructure. The country processes coca paste from Colombia and Peru, mines gold illegally in the Arco Mineiro, a region the size of Portugal, and uses state resources, including military aircraft and officials, to move these commodities to markets in the US, Europe, and beyond. The numbers are staggering. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that roughly 200 to 250 tons of cocaine transit through Venezuela annually, with a wholesale value of approximately $8 billion to $10 billion. The illegal gold trade adds another $1 billion to $2 billion to that figure annually. This isn't corner-level drug dealing. This is industrial-scale commodity trading that happens to be illegal. And here's the crucial financial insight. Commodities respond to supply and demand just like any other market, except the illegal ones respond more dramatically because they can't use courts or banks to smooth out volatility. Let me introduce you to a concept that every drug trafficker understands instinctively, even if they never took an economics course: the risk premium. If I'm a pilot willing to fly cocaine out of Venezuela today, I might charge the cartel $500,000 per flight. That's my compensation for the risk of getting caught by local authorities, which is relatively low given the corruption, and the risk of crashes, which is moderate given the condition of the aircraft and clandestine airstrips. Now the United States imposes a no-fly zone and announces it will shoot down unidentified aircraft. What happens to my price? It doesn't stay at $500,000. I'm now risking getting shot down by an F-16. My survival probability just dropped significantly, so my price goes up, way up, maybe to $2 million per flight, maybe $3 million if I'm one of the few pilots crazy enough to still fly. From the cartel's perspective, this is just a cost increase. And what do businesses do when their costs increase? They pass it on to consumers, in this case, cocaine buyers in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. Here's where the paradox kicks in. If the street price of cocaine increases by 30% to 40% because of the increased transportation costs and risks, does demand disappear? No. Cocaine demand is what economists call inelastic. People who are addicted will pay the higher price. They'll commit more crimes to get the money, or they'll buy slightly less, but they won't stop buying. So the cartels still move product. They move less of it by air, sure, but each kilogram they successfully move is now worth significantly more. The total revenue might actually stay the same or even increase. But wait, there's more, and this is where it gets really perverse. When you dramatically increase the risk and cost of the drug trade, you don't eliminate the trade. You change who dominates it. The small operators, the independent smugglers, the marginal players, they get wiped out. They can't absorb the losses from seized shipments. They can't afford the new expensive routes and methods. They go bankrupt or get killed. Who survives? The biggest, most ruthless, best capitalized cartels. The ones with the resources to shift from air to maritime routes. The ones with enough cash flow to absorb the loss of 3 shipments for every one that gets through. The ones with the political connections and military-grade equipment to adapt. You've just killed their competition for them. This isn't speculation. We watched this exact dynamic play out in Mexico during the war on cartels. When the Mexican and US governments cracked down hard on the Tijuana and Gulf cartels in the 2000s, they didn't end the drug trade. They consolidated it. The Sinaloa cartel and eventually the Jalisco New Generation cartel absorbed the market share, became more powerful, and now move more drugs than ever before using increasingly sophisticated methods. The law of unintended consequences in drug policy is ironclad. When you make trafficking harder without reducing demand, you make the survivors richer and more powerful. Here's the practical reality that undermines the entire strategy. Venezuela has a coastline of 2,800 kilometers. The Caribbean Sea is right there, and every maritime security expert will tell you the same thing. It is virtually impossible to intercept more than 10% to 20% of smuggling attempts in maritime environments. The moment you close Venezuelan airspace, cartels simply pivot. They load cocaine onto fishing boats, cargo ships, submarines. Yes, drug submarines are a real thing. Cartels have built dozens of them and fast boats. They route through neighboring countries with even weaker enforcement capabilities. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy could intercept some of these, but each maritime interdiction costs tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in ship time, fuel, and personnel. Meanwhile, the cartel just built the loss into their business model. They send 10 boats, expecting 2 to get intercepted, and the 8 that get through more than cover the losses. We're playing a game of whack-a-mole, except each swing of the hammer costs millions of dollars, and the moles just multiply and spread out. Let me tie this together with one final financial mechanism that closes the paradox loop. When street prices for cocaine increase in U.S. cities because of supply disruptions, several things happen simultaneously. 1. Existing addicts commit more crimes to afford their habit, creating social costs. 2. Some users switch to cheaper alternatives like fentanyl, which is more deadly. 3. The profit margin for cartels who successfully deliver product increases dramatically. 4. More criminals are attracted to the trade because of the higher profits. 5. Cartels invest their higher profits in corruption, weapons, and infrastructure to protect their business. You've created a vicious cycle where your enforcement action directly funds the strengthening of the organizations you're trying to destroy. This is the financial paradox in its purest form. You spend billions of taxpayer dollars to make your enemy richer, more powerful, and more dangerous. And we haven't even talked about the biggest financial costs yet. Let's talk about what this actually costs the United States, not in abstract military terms, but in real dollars that come out of actual budgets that could be spent on schools, infrastructure, or healthcare. Enforcing a no-fly zone sounds simple. Fly some planes over Venezuela, tell everyone else to stay out, shoot down anyone who doesn't listen. Simple, right? Except it's never simple, and it's never cheap. First, you can't just declare a no-fly zone and hope people respect it. You need to establish air superiority, which means you need to eliminate or suppress Venezuela's air defense systems. They're not top of the line, but they exist. Russian-made S-300 systems, anti-aircraft artillery, radar installations. This means the operation starts with what military planners call SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses. You launch cruise missiles at radar sites and air defense batteries. Each Tomahawk cruise missile costs about $2 million. You might need to launch 50 to 100 of them just in the opening phase. That's $100 million to $200 million before a single pilot enforces the actual no-fly zone. Then you need to maintain a continuous air presence. This isn't like flying a route once a day. You need 24/7 coverage with fighter aircraft, AWACS surveillance planes, tankers for aerial refueling, and all the associated support infrastructure. Let's do some conservative math. You deploy a squadron of F-16s or F-18s. That's about 24 aircraft. Operating cost per flight hour for an F-16 is roughly $25,000 to $30,000 when you factor in fuel, maintenance, and personnel. To maintain continuous coverage, you need multiple aircraft in the air at all times, each flying 4 to 6 hour shifts. You're looking at tens of millions of dollars per month, just in-flight operations. But wait, where are these aircraft based? You need a forward operating base, probably in Colombia or a Caribbean island. That requires diplomatic negotiations, base construction or expansion, support personnel, logistics, and security. Add tens of millions more. We have historical precedents for this cost structure. The no-fly zones over Iraq operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch cost the United States an estimated $1 billion to $2 billion annually to maintain over more than a decade, and Iraq's airspace is comparable in size to Venezuela's. But here's the kicker. Those operations were conducted with international authorization and partner support. A unilateral NFC over Venezuela would be entirely a U.S. cost. No burden sharing with NATO allies, just American taxpayers footing the bill. Conservative estimate, year one costs would probably be $3 billion to $5 billion once you factor in the initial strikes, equipment deployment, base construction, and operational costs. Subsequent years would be $1.5 billion to $2.5 billion annually to maintain. And for what? To maybe reduce air trafficking by 60% to 70%, while watching maritime trafficking increase by similar amounts. You're spending billions to play whack-a-mole. Let's put those numbers in perspective, because billions of dollars are hard to visualize. $3 billion, the estimated first-year cost, is approximately the entire annual budget for the U.S. Marshals Service. Enough to provide free community college tuition for 300,000 students for 1 year. The cost of building 30 to 40 new high schools. The annual budget for the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which actually studies how to reduce drug demand. Here's the painful irony. Every economic study on drug policy shows that demand reduction programs, treatment, education, and rehabilitation are 7 to 10 times more cost-effective at reducing drug use than supply-side interdiction efforts. For the cost of operating this no-fly zone for 3 years, you could fully fund comprehensive addiction treatment for every cocaine user in the United States. You could actually reduce demand, which would collapse prices, which would destroy cartel profits more effectively than any military operation. But that's not politically satisfying. It doesn't involve fighter jets or dramatic press conferences. So we'll probably choose the expensive, ineffective option that makes for better cable news coverage. Now we need to zoom out and look at the bigger geopolitical game board, because this isn't really about Venezuela at all. It's about China and Russia. Venezuela is catastrophically indebted to China. Over the past 15 years, China has loaned Venezuela more than $60 billion, making it one of China's largest debtors globally. Most of these loans are backed by oil. Venezuela promises to deliver oil to China to repay the debt. Russia has a similar, though smaller, stake. Russia has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, sold weapons to the regime, and positioned itself as Venezuela's geopolitical protector against U.S. interference. Here's the financial weapon hidden inside the no-fly zone strategy. If the U.S. destabilizes Venezuela's economy severely enough, and cutting off air transportation would do that, Venezuela's oil production falls even further. The country becomes even less capable of servicing its debts to China and Russia. This isn't a bug in the strategy, it might be a feature. The U.S. could be deliberately trying to hand China a massive non-performing loan problem while simultaneously signaling to Russia that its geopolitical investments can be zeroed out by U.S. military action. Financially, this is psychological warfare against Beijing and Moscow. You're forcing them to choose, write off tens of billions in loans and investments, or escalate their own involvement in Venezuela to protect their assets. But here's where this gets dangerous. If the U.S. establishes a precedent that major powers can unilaterally declare no-fly zones over countries where they have strategic interests, what stops China from declaring a no-fly zone over Taiwan? What stops Russia from declaring one over Ukraine or the Baltic states? International law exists for a reason. When you ignore it because you have the military power to do so, you invite others to do the same. And while the United States has the world's most powerful military, we don't have a monopoly on military power or on countries with strategic interests that conflict with ours. The financial risk here is global instability. Investors hate uncertainty. If major powers start routinely declaring no-fly zones without international authorization, global air travel becomes unpredictable. Insurance markets seize up. Supply chains that depend on air cargo, which is most modern supply chains, become unreliable. The financial contagion from normalized great power airspace closures would be measured in trillions of dollars in economic disruption. We'd be trading $2 billion a year in operational costs for potentially trillions in systemic economic risk. That's not strategic thinking, that's financial suicide. Let's bring this all together and answer the question we started with. Would a no-fly zone over Venezuela choke the cartels, or would it be a multi-billion-dollar subsidy for organized crime paid by taxpayers and legitimate businesses? The evidence is overwhelming. This strategy fails on every level. On the cost side, we have billions in direct military spending annually, hundreds of millions in increased costs to legitimate aviation and commerce, massive legal liability exposure from potential incidents, trillions in potential global economic disruption from normalized great power airspace conflicts, geopolitical escalation risks with China and Russia. These costs are certain, they will happen. Day one, the meter starts running. On the benefit side, we have maybe a 60% to 70% reduction in air trafficking, which gets replaced by maritime trafficking, which the cartels adapt to within months, leading to consolidation that makes surviving cartels more powerful. While street prices increase, making each successful shipment more profitable, creating a more violent, more efficient, more dangerous drug trafficking ecosystem. These benefits are somewhere between uncertain and counterproductive. Any honest cost-benefit analysis leads to one conclusion. This is expensive geopolitical theater that will make the problem worse while costing billions. So what's the alternative? If kinetic military operations don't work, what does? The answer lies in targeting financial infrastructure rather than physical infrastructure. Drug cartels don't run on airplanes, they run on money. Cut off their ability to move, launder, and invest money, and you destroy them more effectively than any military operation. Here's what actually works. Financial intelligence and monitoring. Every dollar of drug money eventually enters the legitimate financial system somewhere. Banks are already required to file suspicious activity reports. The problem isn't lack of laws, it's lack of enforcement and international cooperation. The U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control could do more damage to cartels with 100 financial analysts than the Air Force could with 100 fighter jets. Cryptocurrency tracking. Modern cartels increasingly use cryptocurrency to move money across borders, but cryptocurrency isn't anonymous, it's pseudonymous. Every transaction is recorded on a public blockchain. Companies like Chainalysis have become remarkably good at tracing crypto flows. This is a data analysis problem, not a military problem, and it costs millions, not billions. Asset forfeiture and seizure. When you identify cartel money in the banking system, you freeze it and seize it. This is direct, immediate financial damage. One well-executed financial seizure operation can confiscate hundreds of millions of dollars, the equivalent of interdicting dozens of smuggling operations, but without the multi-billion-dollar price tag. Targeting state complicity. The real innovation in Venezuela isn't the trafficking, it's the state involvement. Venezuelan officials, military officers, and government agencies are directly involved in facilitating drug trafficking and illegal gold mining. This creates a paper trail. Financial sanctions targeting these individuals, their families, and their assets can be devastating. You make it impossible for them to enjoy their wealth anywhere in the world. That changes behavior fast. International cooperation on money laundering. Most drug money doesn't stay in Venezuela. It flows to banks in Panama, Colombia, the US, and Europe. International anti-money laundering enforcement, when it's actually funded and executed, can make it nearly impossible for cartels to bank their profits. You create a situation where they're cash-rich but effectively trapped. They can't buy properties, invest in businesses, or enjoy their wealth. That breaks the economic incentive that drives the entire trade. These strategies aren't as viscerally satisfying as watching an F-16 shoot down a smuggler's plane. They don't produce dramatic video for CNN, but they work, they're cost-effective, and they don't create the perverse incentives that military operations create. The fundamental lesson here is one that applies to finance, economics, and policy. Always follow the incentives. When you make drug trafficking more dangerous, you make it more profitable for those who survive. When you create higher costs for cartels, they pass those costs to consumers. When you restrict supply without reducing demand, you inflate prices and profits. These aren't bugs in the system, they're fundamental features of how markets work. The only way to destroy an illegal market is to eliminate demand or to make the market unprofitable. Demand reduction requires public health interventions, treatment, education, and addressing the social conditions that drive addiction. Making the market unprofitable requires choking off the money flows that make it worthwhile. Military operations do neither. They're expensive, they're counterproductive, and they make the problem worse while creating the illusion of action. There's a saying in finance, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every decision has costs, and those costs have to be paid by someone. A no-fly zone over Venezuela might score political points. It might look decisive. It might make officials feel like they're doing something about drugs and Maduro. But make no mistake about who pays the price. American taxpayers funding multi-billion-dollar military operations, travelers facing higher ticket prices and longer flights, businesses dependent on air cargo facing supply chain disruptions, Latin American communities losing air connectivity and economic opportunities. And who benefits? The most ruthless, well-capitalized drug cartels who will adapt, consolidate, and emerge stronger and richer than before. That's the financial paradox. When you try to fight economic problems with military solutions, you usually just redistribute wealth from taxpayers to criminals while making the problem worse. The smart money isn't on fighter jets and missiles. It's on financial intelligence, international cooperation, and public health interventions. Those strategies are less dramatic, but they actually work. And in the end, results matter more than theater, at least they should. If you made it this far, you now understand why financial analysis matters just as much as military strategy, sometimes more. The next time you hear a politician propose a military solution to a drug problem, ask them one simple question: who pays and who profits? The answer will tell you everything you need to know. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button. We dig deep into the financial side of history's biggest decisions here at Vaulted Wisdom. Drop a comment telling me what topic you want us to analyze next. Should we look at the economics of other failed drug war policies, the financial incentives behind other geopolitical conflicts? Let me know. And if you really want to understand how money shapes history, check out our video on Insert Relevant Video Title. It's linked in the description. Until next time, remember, follow the money, question the narratives, and always understand the incentives. That's where the real wisdom is vaulted.